Okay. So before we get going, I have to head to the airport tomorrow morning. So I wanted to thank Bill for all the taping, and again thank the folks who put this together, Bill and his crew, and all of you for being here and sticking through this afternoon and allowing Steve and I the latitude to speak freely. And I just want to thank Steve. We're on the road a lot together. I see him a lot, and what you see is what you get. They're not blowing smoke. This guy's a class act, and I love spending time with him. It's a real treat to do this with him. It's our first time, so thank you. Steve said something to me over the phone. He says, my wife Connie's becoming a real fan of yours, but I'm trying to talk her out of it. So that's... So we take a look at step 8, and it talks about first creating this list, which is, for me, the preparation before we do some heavy lifting. And it says we look at steps 8 and 9 with a list of all persons we have harmed, pardon me, and willing to make amends. A lot of this Fort's 8-step list I'm going to pull from step 4 in looking at the harms caused. But that doesn't mean for me it's complete. I still need to go into this step 8. I'm praying for the willingness to go to make amends to every single person on the list God gives me. Drug dealers, gangsters, ex-wives, bosses I embezzle from. My job at this point is become willing to go to everyone on that list. Step 9 is going to tell me except when to do so to injure them or others. So that's why I like to call this getting prepared to go out there, in some cases hat in hand. So I create this list, and I pull out a whole bunch of stuff that come off of 4, and God will reveal more to me. Understanding, as I do now, that whatever list I come up with and whatever amends I do make, that the journey is not done, because more will be revealed as I proceed. In a year from now, I might think of a harm cause. Going through the work, I might come up with something else, and I might continue to harm people along the way too. So it's a never-ending process, but it's certainly one of growing and understanding and effectiveness journey. And so I make a list of people, and my job is not to censor or edit it. Now, I know some folks like to put down never make amends, maybe make amends, ready to make amends. And if that's what you do, I'm not here to change that. I would just have a different influence, that God will give me whatever is needed as He sees fit to go see these people. And so I just write a list, and I'm praying for willingness. The first time out, well, let me say this. I remember Don sitting with me. He says, if you really were practicing principles in all your affairs, and really, in this work, you'll get to a point in your work or your inventory where you're really not going to have much of a list. There might not be anyone on the harms caused list that time out. That's not to say you're not going to do it again. And I'm happy to report to you, as I've done this work over and over and over again, that list has dwindled. The first time out, I probably made about 200 direct amends. And there were some I couldn't go to, which was some people call the indirect amends, putting back to the universe and treating people different. I couldn't go knock on an old girlfriend's door and say, hey, remember me? And she's married with kids, and have to go back to make amends for making amends. But that list has shrunk over the years. And it's just testament to what God has done for me. This work speaks loudly for the power that cannot be spoken about. And so I have this list, and I began to pray for willingness to go to everyone on that list. And I really take a look at this. How could I possibly live now knowing how I lived then? How could I possibly be present here and effective here and understanding to others if I'm still driven by voices from the past? I can't. How could I truly enter the world of the Spirit, as the book describes, if I'm still dragging one leg in the past? It can't do it. I need to be able to pass through that eye of a needle free. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to ever cause harm again, but up until that point, I'm pretty clean. So I make this list. I begin praying for willingness to go out, and I have a list of people. Now, before social media, I would put down where I think they live or how maybe I can get in touch with them because there are people on there I lost contact with. But there's so many things now, it's really next to impossible not to find someone. It was a little different the first time out. So I would write down, we used to do a sheet of paper, then we got fancy, we started doing index cards, and if you didn't have an index card, you weren't a good AA big book guy. We got into this thing. How many index, could you get index cards? Like God's interested in index cards, just go do the work. But I did go to index cards. And they were messy because I got terrible handwriting, I write big, so it was like Joe on the front and Bill on the back. I mean, it was, so I just put a sheet of paper, that's what I do. And I'd write down the person's name and perhaps a phone number and the harm caused. I stole from Bill. I stole from Mary. I cheated on Mary. I gossiped about Bill, whatever it was. And I have this list. And there were times where I would call people up if I had a phone number. I go see them at work. Most of my first time out of men's were at work. I was a longshoreman. I worked on the docks in Brooklyn. Took money that didn't belong to me. Took things that didn't belong to me. Borrowed a ton of money, never paid it back. Borrowed money from people who I would drop names, starting with my dad's name, and put him in hot water, and they want a little bit back each week until you pay off the whole thing. And if you don't come pay them, they look for you. And it's not like a 12-step call. And I was in trouble. So I start making amends, praying every morning for the willingness, and some of them I'm afraid to go see, and I prayed for courage, strength, and direction. And little by slowly, this list started to get smaller. I'm making amends. And I remember my dad and my brothers and my grandparents were at the top of that list. And my sponsor had said to me, I'm not going to edit this for you. He says, but I want you to understand something. How many times have you said, I'm sorry, it'll never happen again? And you did it again. He says, your sermon is going to be the walk. Remember this. The walk is the sermon. The walk is the sermon. The walk is not to talk. They've heard it all. He says, if I was you, I would wait until you walk the walk for a while, that your actions speak louder than any words you can come up with. And so I took that instruction. And I went back to work, and as I said, I took a lot of things that belonged to me and borrowed money and never paid it back. And I would go to work, and I would get there really early. And there was a little diner they called it the Hole in the Wall Diner. And because at one time there was a bank next door to it, and these bank robbers went through the diner, punched a hole in the wall into the bank, and stole money back in the 50s. So they called it the Hole in the Wall Diner. And my dad and his friends and the workers on the docks, they'd be there at 5 o'clock in the morning, you know. I said, when I get old, I'll probably get up that early. I get up at 5 o'clock now, so. And they'd be there having coffee and just smoking cigarettes and talking. And I knew that. A lot of truck drivers were there, and a lot of longshoremen were there. So I would get there early, and I would wait outside. And as they would come out, I would do like drive-by amends. They'd come out, and I'd see this truck driver, that longshoreman. I'd say, do you have a minute for me? And a lot of them were like, I don't have any money, and walk away. What do you want? Does your father know you're out here? They knew I was up to no good, but I wasn't this time. And in the meantime, I'm going to work, like an AA taught me, I'm going to work early and staying late. I'm getting to work early, and I would wait for whoever was the supervisor to say, kid, go home. And when I wasn't working, we were outdoors most of the time. I'd pick up a broom and just start sweeping, keeping busy. And they gave me an hour. We get an hour and a half lunch, 11:30 to 1. I was back at work before 1, and that's when I got a hold of these two guys named Joe and Charlie. And I had cassette tapes, and I had a little cassette recorder, and I used to have, where my workstation outside, I used to play Joe and Charlie. I had my big book, and people would say, how many times are you going to read that book? How many times have you read it? And you listen to those same two guys again? I mean, you got it by now. They didn't get it. And that's how it would, it'd take me 15 minutes to eat lunch, and that's what I would do. So I'd see these guys coming out of the diner, and some of them would stop, what's up? And I said, I borrowed $20 from you like 2 years ago, and I would have $30 in my hand for them. because that's what I was told to do. And I would ask them, what can I do to make it right? The amends part was not only fixing this, but my change. And a lot of them would say, oh, forget about it, it's no big deal, I'm glad you're okay now. But that's what I would do. And I'd go to work and start paying back all the men I worked. I would take money out of my paycheck each week and put $100 aside because that didn't belong to me. I'd pay my bills and the rest had to go back into the universe. And my sponsor taught me well. And without dragging someone through the mud, I was clear on what I had done. I need to talk to him about that. And what can I do to make this right was a piece of this. See, I would look at, if I took $20 off you and we're lifelong friends, and I took $20 off you and I come back with $20 or $30, it looks like it's clean. And I look at the external harm, not realize it causing an internal wound on somebody. How do you fix that? Yeah, I'm glad to have my money, but I thought we were friends. Why didn't you just ask me? How could you steal from me? So those harms went deep. And I had to make some effort to repair this. Because they were still smart for my injustice to them, and I'm pouring poison all over my soul again. We feel a man is unthinking when he says sobriety is enough. How can I possibly enter the world of the Spirit and be free here when I know if John or Bill or Mary walk in the door, I got to get tight because I harmed them. Or if I'm in the supermarket, oh my God, there they are, which happened to me. And so I'm making these amends, and little by slowly I'm cleaning up that part of my life. I'm getting to work early, and I'm staying late, and I'm doing the meetings, and I have a sponsor, and I have a home group, and people started to talk to me differently now. I was very much aware of that. In fact, my belly button birthday is July 14th, and I went to work one day, and a bunch of longshoremen were huddled in the corner, and they were calling me over. I said, oh man, what did I do now? This doesn't look good. And it was supposed to be a birthday cake. I don't know what it was, like a squash donut or something. And they had matches for candles in it. And they sang happy birthday to me. And they gave me hugs and, these little friendly slaps on the face and messing up my hair a whole bunch, and how proud they were. And I was a member among members again. But that doesn't mean now I can go, come in late again and leave early. It's just the way I was taught to do, and it became a way of life. And then one day, it was a while into this, I had put money aside. I had a little envelope in my dresser drawer, and I kept putting money in this envelope, and I was going to make an attempt to arrange a payment deal with my dad to pay him back for all the lawyers, all the money I stole, just all of it. And I went to work one morning, and I saw my dad like I usually do, and I asked him, I says, can I talk to you a few minutes? It wasn't just going to be coffee talk. It was going to be like something hot talk. And he recognized that. He said, absolutely. So we went off to the side and sat down, and he says, what's the matter? And I began the approach. The approach, not the amends wasn't done yet, the approach. And I got like a handful of sentences out, and my dad put up his hand. And I'll never forget this. He says, all I ever wanted was my son back. He didn't want the money. And he went on, this tough guy from South Brooklyn went on to praise the men and women in Alcoholics Anonymous. It says something along the lines of, you keep doing what those people tell you to do. And my job was to now continue to be a son to my dad and a brother to my two kid brothers and so on. And I took that money because I called my sponsor, that's fabulous, that's absolutely great news, but that money is not yours. You need to do something with that money. So before you buy a shirt or a pair of sneakers or a jacket, think of ways you can put that money back into the universe. Put some extra money in a home group basket. Go to a group that's struggling, put some extra money, put some in the poor box at church, whatever you want to do. Some charity. Now, I had a great respect for men and women who served this country. It's just something near and dear to me. I'm hoping my business, I'm trying to get something where we can cater to those men and women who are alcoholic and addict and went to defend freedom and came back banged up. My heart breaks for them. And I have uncles who served. My dad spent some time in the Korean War, so it's near and dear to me. And I happened to get in the mail one day like an advertisement for something called the Disabled American Veterans something like Association. And that's it. So for about 5 years or so, I kept writing out a check, $5, $10, $20, whatever it was, and sending money for about 5 years. And that bled into something else that breaks my heart is homeless people. Sometimes they're icky to look at, and they're incoherent, and they're in rough shape. So was I. And I was a young kid. They were an inconvenience. I used to walk past them. And then I became one, and I know what it's like to get spit on and cursed and beat up when you're homeless, because that happened to me. And my amends back to the universe became feeding the homeless. And I still give money. In fact, one of the things I started to do, and it's nothing from me, just given to me, I pulled up to an exit, and there was a homeless person with the sign, and giving up $20 is not going to break my back, thank you, God. And I had a $20 bill on me, and I rolled down the window, and I says, how's it going? And he just looked at me, hey, what's your name? And it was as if his whole world stopped for a moment. Whatever his name was, he said, Bill. I said, I'm Peter. Someone recognized this guy as a person rather than this homeless derelict on the street. And I slipped him $20 and talked to him as long as the light lasted red. And I wished him well and drove away. And I've been doing that for the longest time, giving back to the universe. We can talk a whole bunch about mechanics here. But what does it look like going live? And I learned a lesson. I won't say where I was, but I was at one of these weekends, and this gentleman picked me up, very, very wealthy guy, in a brand new big Escalade, and talking. I said, what do you do for a living? We're talking about careers, and he had this huge business, and God's blessed me with finances, and we went on and on. And later on, we're in a diner, and the topic turned to, being charitable and what God has done for us, and I got into homeless people. And he says, I never give them money. I just pray for them and keep driving. Well, that's pretty shabby. That's pretty shabby. So the way God has molded me is to take care of his kids, not only in Alcoholics Anonymous. I was sitting in a diner one time in a restaurant, and on the other side of the restaurant was a family gathering of some family. I don't know who it was. There was obviously something on there. Probably Italian like me, because they were loud and obnoxious, and I knew they were probably cut from the same cloth I am. And I was with my ex-wife at the time. I think we were still dating. Now, there was a gentleman on my 8-step list that when I put his name down, I knew the harm's caused, but I'm not going to this guy. There's no way I'm going to him. And I had some 4-letter words along with that, because he threw me out, and he cursed me out, and called me everything under the sun when he threw me out of this apartment when I went homeless. And he wasn't a warm and fuzzy guy, and I pretty much still hated him. So I'm in this restaurant, and I order a soft drink, and looking at the menu, and I happen to look up, and I don't know, maybe where that gentleman is sitting right there from where I am, there's a guy eyeballing me with his buddy. And his eyes are like lasers. And I recognize that as that landlord. And I'm getting really uncomfortable. So uncomfortable, I told my ex-wife, we need to get out of here. She said, what's wrong? I'll explain later. And I went to the phone and I called my sponsor. I told him what's going on. He gave me some instructions. I had to write some more inventory, resentment inventory. And I had to do a whole lot of praying for the willingness and to forgive this guy for whatever I think he did to me. And every morning, as much as I didn't mean, I prayed for willingness to go make amends to this guy. I trashed this place. I owed him money. I brought all sorts of unsavory characters into this place. It was a pigsty when I left. I really mean a pigsty. The kitchen sink was backed up for months and the water turned green. Nothing worked in the place. I used to sneak in through the back not to pay rent. It was just ugly. I can't believe I lived that way at one point. My friend Ralph always says, I'm not that guy on the first, fourth step anymore. I'm not him. And so I, again, getting an envelope and putting money in there every week. Just so I know it's there. It's not in the bank where I'll use it for a bill. This is amends money. And one morning I woke up and I'm getting dressed, like as if I was coming to speak at a meeting. Because my sponsor told me you don't get dressed like you're going to commit a felony. You get dressed. If you're going to go make amends, you be proper and you give those people respect. They remember you one way, show them what God has done. And I got dressed and I shaved and put on a nice sport jacket. And I took this money and I went to the house. I rang the bell and the wife answered and she was, oh my God. And she invited me in. The husband came out from the kitchen and what's going on? And I began the approach. And I told him, what a terrible tenant I was and how truly sorry I was. But sorry is really about getting me off the hook. I was there to make restitution. My behavior had changed. And I took out the envelope of money. And I says, I don't even know if this is going to cover it. I think it will. But whatever it is, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to pay you back every dime, any money you laid out of your pocket for some of the repairs that were done. And I told him I'm a member of AA now. I never lead with that, but it presented itself to say that. I never tell someone I'm here because if I don't, I'll drink again. That sounds like it's full of me again. But I did tell him I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. My life has changed a lot, and I need to fix up some of these things. I know I've harmed you in a terrible way. And we talked a little bit. She says, we thought you died. She says, we saw you carrying out the TV one night, and we saw you coming in, 3 days later, and we saw how you looked. We didn't know what was going on. We don't know much about drugs and alcohol. And then she told me something. She said, how's your dad? I says, he's good. We work together, and we're getting along pretty well. And then she said something, and I realized the impact. Sorry. The impact of my behavior on others. She said very matter of fact. She asked me about my dad, and she says, he'd come here and ring our bell. He would ask them, have you seen my son? I can't find him. And she described my dad, this tough guy, this look in his eyes. She said he was petrified. I'm glad you guys are together. I'm glad for your life. And which I had to hear that. She didn't say to me, you ruined it, you wrecked it. She was concerned about another person. I had to hear that to once again understand what alcoholism did to me and to my family. Why they were tight, why my dad would bark. Fear had him in its grip. And I gave them the money, and the husband and I, who still wasn't warm and fuzzy, pretty stoic, we shook hands. They wished me well. And then everything changed again because I've shared this from a million podiums. I can never do it justice. But I had to walk up about, 10 steps into their house. And I had this little basement apartment next to a garage. And as I'm leaving, I kind of remember walking down these steps. And when I got to the sidewalk, everything changed. If I can describe this. It wasn't something that was going on that I'm saying, oh my God, I'm having an experience. I can't wait to go home group and tell them. I was taken from that place, if I can describe it. I couldn't feel my shoes hitting the concrete on the sidewalk. I felt as if I was just surrounded in this like white, yellow kind of cocoon of light. My eyes filled up and they were weeping, and it was beyond euphoria. But I wasn't thinking, I'm walking to my car now. I got to call my sponsor. I was just plucked out of this space and time, if this is making any kind of sense. If you had an experience like this, you know what I'm talking about. That's the last thing I remember until I was putting the key in the door at my apartment. Knowing that I'm known by my creators, what happened to me on an amends I did not want to go to. I wasn't going to this guy. And our book talks about how those difficult ones seem to be the most beneficial. It's a force feeding you humility, and if I'm in a place of humility, I'm standing before my Creator. I'm not when I'm full of ego and I got it. I was made completely vulnerable, completely transparent. I didn't want any of it. The ego didn't want this, and Spirit says, we're going. It was another turning point. I love the word he used before, this turning point in my life. I've never been the same, and God didn't give one of those. He, over time, we're here long enough, we get these little God moments, these God winks, these aha things that came out of amends. If I really believe that I'm alcoholic, then I have to understand that not completing the amends that I can make without causing more harm is going to get me drunk. I'm going to go out there, start knocking on doors and making phone calls or sending messages. If I truly want to enter the world of the Spirit and save my ass here and really be free, then I need to go make amends, because if I'm not, I begin to go backwards through the steps again. Got a bunch of amends, I'll get to it. Defects are starting to show up, I'll work on them. I'm not confessing anything to a sponsor, so I'm getting plaque on the soul. Turn it over, I make my own decisions, because little by slow I'm becoming God. Insane thoughts are coming back. I'm acting out a lot of different ways, then I'm drunk, and I just went backwards through the steps. So I started out on this journey. One of the coolest things, I was running with a lot of guys who were always talking about steps and amends, steps and amends. You know what that does? It shakes things up, and you say, I just thought of an amends. I just came out of nowhere. That's Spirit talking. God cares more about me than I do about myself. We got to patch this up, we got to go fix that, and we got to do this. And there were people I couldn't see. I was really hot for this work when I first started. I was going to, you guys might remember the old Jack LaLanne gyms. And I walk into Jack LaLanne's, and I'm thinking I'm spiritual because I'm working out. Like, look at me, I must be spiritual. And I see a guy there with another guy, and it was a cop who I took my first arrest with. As I got to go over to him, I'm a spiritual guru now, and tell him how sorry I was for copping drugs that day made your life difficult. And I went up to him, he says, get away from me, and walked away. That's what he said, get away from me, and walked away. I ran to the phone, called my sponsor. My sponsor went up one side, down the other. You didn't even write a fourth step yet. Where do you get off? You don't know who that other person was. You don't do things like that. My sponsor made me right size. But over time, people come in contact with you, and I remember I was still working on it, docs. It's interesting. When I finished all the men's I was consciously aware of at my longshoreman job, I was called into the business I'm doing now. Not a day before, not a day later. I was done. That body of work was done. God kept me there for about a year and a half into sobriety, 2 years into sobriety maybe, and I made this one amends I'm going to tell you, but that was the last one that I was aware of. And short time later, this guy, Vince Dowling, took me into the business I'm in now. He says, you're going to be good in this. I'm going to train you. I said, okay. I didn't know what I was getting into. Well, there's this one truck driver. He was about 6'12". His hands were as big as this podium, and he was one of those guys you would hear his voice down the block when he was showing up. Just a loud, just a big man and loud. And everyone knew him. Now, what I did to this guy in my day, and the term is called shaking someone down, meant I wasn't going to perform my job unless he gave me some money. Totally illegal. Go to jail for that. And he wasn't having it. And I cursed him out, looking up you. I mean, he could have just squashed me. There's a reason why he didn't say anything. And I found out in the amends. And I hear him, and I know I need to go pull this guy aside and make amends for my verbal assault on this guy. I humiliated him, at least I thought, in front of a bunch of people. It's a very macho, a lot of testosterone on the waterfront. Can't look bad ever. Hit first, ask questions later. And I went up to him, and he just kind of shook it off, and he gave me a hug and lifted me up off the ground. And he says, your pop does nothing but talk about you. My dad referred to me getting sober as I beat it. I beat this thing called addiction, this thing called alcoholism. He says, I see your dad every morning across the street in a hole, and always does talk about my son Peter, my son Peter, my son Peter. He says, you don't know this. Your dad and I go back. I remember when your dad dated your mom, we're lifelong friends. That's why the guy never retaliated against me. He said, I remember when your dad just stand on the street corner waiting for you to come to work and you disappeared for 2 days. I knew all the times you went to treatment. The first time I went to treatment, my dad told everybody I had a pneumonia. I was in the hospital. I was sick. We knew what was going on. And that body of work was done. I never took 1 penny off of anyone illegally ever. In fact, they tried to buy me coffee. I would buy coffee. It was my way of giving back. I was made different. And some of those guys were looking to do illegal things. I says, you stay, keep me out of it. I'm going to work. And a lot of people resented me for that. But I couldn't do that. I couldn't live that life anymore. I was living a clean life. My mom was very, very sick. Alcoholic, addicted to narcotics, and some psych issues, in and out institutions, suicide attempts, the whole thing. This poor woman. And I remember pleading with her on the phone when she would get a phone call in some psych ward, please come home. Then I would tell her, stay as long as it takes. Mom, come home and please get better, and things like that. And she just got worse and worse. And when she committed suicide, I was just distraught and broken and furious. She just cut out like that. And I harbored that for a long time. And one weekend, Mark H. and this guy Joe were in New York doing Fellowship of the Spirit. And I had been praying and meditating. And in a meditation one time, I had this experience. And it was giving directions. And I was telling Mark about it. And I says, I don't know if this means anything, but my room smelled like I was in a florist, like roses, and that's when I got his attention. And he says, that's an experience. Don't tell anyone about it yet. And I spoke to this priest, Father Jeff, in Staten Island, New York. He said, that happened to you. That's very, very profound. So God was working for me. And in this meditation, I was instructed to go back to the street corner on Van Brunt Street and Walcott Street in Red Hook, Brooklyn, where my mom had this nervous breakdown when I was 3 years old. It was horrific. I didn't know it was a nervous breakdown back then. And Mark was heading back to Texas, and Joe came out of the back room. He's told Joe what happened. Joe will take you tomorrow to go to this spot. That's what the meditation told me to do. I didn't know I was about to make somewhat of an amends for these ugly feelings I was having about my mom. When my mom had this nervous breakdown, my brother John was a new boy. It was just me and him. And I went down to that spot. And I remember my mom punching or slapping this wall in this hysterics, and somebody covering my eyes. And the next thing I remember, I was in the hospital, and my mom, I remember, in hysterics, and she had this funny jacket on. That's what I called it, the funny jacket. And they closed the door, and I was with my grandparents. And I went up to that wall where I think she was punching the time. This is many, many years later. And I made an amends that way. How truly sorry I was that I couldn't help you. And I was angry with you for leaving me. And I said something kind of funny, like, I'm like you now, and I get it. You were doing the best you could, what you had under the circumstances. I get it. I tried to end my life one time in a flea bag motel with a bunch of pills. I get it. And I was going back to the car to get in. I thought my work was done, and I opened up the door, and I couldn't get in the car. Joe was sitting in the car smoking cigarettes, and I just something, as if something was this force field, something. I couldn't, wouldn't let me in the car. And I said, Joe, I don't know what it is. I can't get in the car. He got out of the car immediately. He's able to pray about this. Now, this neighborhood turned into the hood. So you got these two guys on their knees praying off a street corner. People peeking through their blinds. And Joe's walking around, and I hear Joe laugh. He said, you need to take a look at what's in the concrete. He knew my whole story. He knew about this event. And they used to pump oil into the house from the street curb. Used to have these things on the side that said Petro. He said, that's interesting. It's like your name. He said, but you need to see what's next to it. And was written in the concrete, my hand to God. Joe shared this story at a couple of podiums. What was written in the concrete was the following. You know when you write your name in the concrete, for a memory and it stays there? To Peter and Johnny with love and X's underneath it. That was written in the concrete. My brother was about 1 or 2 at the time. I was around 3.5 or 4. And I saw that, and Joe just had this warm, sinister laugh about him, as if to say, "You doubt God anymore?" Now, I've said this a million. Anyone could have wrote that anyone could have, who knew of Peter and John, could have wrote that in the concrete. It's possible. It's also possible something else happened. I don't know. But I know in that moment, I knew God gave me another wink, like, I know this is tough for you, but I got you. I'm with you. I feel the pain. Your mom's okay. This is from me to you. Keep chopping wood and carrying wood. I got you. Don't worry about the flack you get from people. Don't worry about anything. I'm walking with you. I'm jumping in front of the bullets for you. I got you. You keep doing my work. You'll be safe and protected until I call you home. The ride back, we talked more about amends, and we walked into a meeting. The speaker didn't show up, and he says, "We need a speaker for tonight." I said, "Well, my buddy's here from California." It was nice. It was a step 9 topic, and Joe talked about that. He had a million 9-step stories. He talked about that. And again, God pulled another layer of doubt and skepticism off me, all in this 9-step process. And where I am right now, I've been this way. I mean, I always say in an hour from now, tomorrow morning, a week from now, that might change. But I don't have anything from the past haunting me. That's a lot of freedom. And I thank God and AA for that. You know, I give God my soul, and he gives me a life. I give him my life, and he gives me a purpose. I've given him my drunkenness, and he's given me sobriety. I've given him my sinfulness, and he's given me forgiveness. I give him my sobriety, he gives me Alcoholics Anonymous. None of it makes sense. But the process of cleaning up the wreckage of the past is really what really gets me free. I have no skeletons in the closet. I am what I am, broken and flawed, and trying to have a spiritual experience, trying to continue to awaken. The last thing I'll say is this. I think I may have said this last night, I don't recall, but I was in AA boot camp like all of us. Sobriety is the number one priority. Well, it is a priority. But my number one priority is having conscious contact with God. To please, to serve, to go wherever he wants me to go. And when I do that, I'm sober. When I do that, Steve talked about the other things that accompany alcoholism. I'm staying out of harm's way. Not perfect. I want to be really clear, not perfect. I tumble over my own feet sometimes. I get my own way. Thank God Marion says, "Honey, let me explain what's going on," and offers a solution. And I have some friends up in Jersey who have been with me on most of this ride. One guy knows me as long as I'm sober. And so we walk. Freddie and Maribeth and Jimmy A. We've been through it all together, and we're still here. They lean on me, I've leaned on them, all because of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I get to spend time with the guy I've admired for years. And here we are presenting together. That's all I got. Peace.
Thank you, Peter. Hey guys, Steve Alcoholic. First, I got to say that your endurance is remarkable. That it is, and Dane, I don't know whether Dane got in trouble or something. He's been standing up the whole time, and I think that there's some penance he's paying. I don't know what that is. Lost a bet or something. But Peter and I, and while Peter's here, I too want to say. Not just how much I enjoy and appreciate being invited here, and I'll say it again tomorrow because it's true every time, but to share the time in this space with Peter and with Marion has been a particular treat for me, and I'm grateful for that. And when I come out of that 7-step prayer, right, and I think that this is all leading us someplace, right, and steps 5, 6, and 7 are so concerned with humility. They're the bridge from me getting this information about myself and the preparation to now go stand in front of these things. This is the first time when we get, or I get to steps 8 and 9, it's the first time that I'm really taking my recovery outside and standing in front of people and owning the things that I have done and actively seeking to make reparations where possible. So after that 7-step prayer, it said, now more action will be called for, right? It says reminding ourselves that reminding ourselves that in the beginning we said we were willing to go to any length, right? All the way back in How It Works. It says if you've decided you want what we have and are willing to go to any length to get it, then you're ready to take certain steps. That means all of them. And I have a friend who, when he sponsors guys, when they get there in the book and they're looking at it, he'll say, do you want, have you decided you're an alcoholic? Yeah. Do you want what we have? Yeah. You willing to go to any length to get it? Yeah. All right. He says, sign and date this, please. And he'll have him sign and date that. He says, because we're going to be coming back here later, because you're going to go, oh, but not that, And I say, look, all the way back here, 6 weeks ago, you said you'd go to any length. And so reminding myself I'm willing to go to any length. And it says, because in the moment when I'm trying to get my life in order, we are trying to get our lives back in order, but our real purpose is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and our fellows. It looks like at the beginning, and maybe they don't even tell me early on, maybe I overlook it, it looks like I'm trying to do all this so I can now live comfortably in my recliner watching TV without the baggage of my past. But it is really trying to free me up from me so I can be of some use to you. But paradoxically, it is by offering to be of some use to you that I get what I needed all along and what was missing. And we will revisit that theme through the 10th, 11th, and 12th step as well. But for me, it's been useful. And we often talk about that probably no step benefits more from the guidance of a sponsor or even other, seasoned members who've had the experience. And because it says in the 12 and 12, like the first sentence on the 9th step, so it must be let me know right away that what I will need to go about this business is good judgment, a careful sense of timing, courage, and prudence. These are the characteristics that are needed to go about the 9th step. And since those characteristics are needed, I have to outsource them again because I don't have them. So I got to go to somebody who has good judgment, courage, prudence, and a careful sense of timing. And that's typically a sponsor. And over time, I have all of those qualities when I'm dealing with your problem. But when I'm dealing with my problem, somehow these things tighten up a little bit and I'm not as clear. The courage maybe vacillates, certainly the good judgment, the careful sense of timing. But I will say, and this is I don't think in a contradiction to what Peter said, but and it was my experience looking back at it. It says that there will be some amends we make as soon as we are reasonably certain that we might stay sober. And whether it's an amends or not, I'm not sure. But I will tell you, when I came home from that treatment experience, so I'm coming back into my home, a sober man, to the extent, at least what a 30-day sober man looked like. I talked to my wife and daughter and let them know in a fairly general way that I know I hadn't lived up to my responsibilities, that I've been a bad actor in some cases. Because I don't think I could walk in there and say, you know what, guys, I'm glad you're here. About 3 months, I'm going to be back. We're going to have a little meeting in here about 6 months. I'm going to tell you how sorry I am. That I wanted to initiate, and I wasn't thinking in terms of the 8th and 9th step. This sort of happened naturally, but when I see that, I realize that there's some things where I can make a general drive-by for folks that I'm interacting with at that level, that intimate a relationship, to acknowledge at least that I know things haven't been all that great. I get with my sponsor, did the 4th and 5th step, and then I'm beginning to work on that 8-step list, and I crafted that. And again, that 8-step list wasn't limited to who was in my 4th step, because there are people that I've harmed that I had no resentment against, right? I've done, you didn't have to tick me off for me to do some harm to you. A lot of people I harmed were perhaps even unaware of the harm. But I had a good beginning in that inventory. And then we would talk about those other things. And the 12 and 12 says that, in a practical way, and I mentioned it before, but we may consider how we've harmed someone physically, mentally, spiritually, or emotionally. And that both broadened my list, and it also deepened the harms to the people closest to me, where I had done that mental and emotional harm in a way that I hadn't considered. I didn't consider it and dismiss it. I just didn't think to consider it. I didn't think that way because I am still so selfish and self-centered. It's just not naturally working that way. I've got to be introduced to these ideas. But I'm also really grateful, and for me it's been important to have a clear separation between the 8th and 9th step. Now that separation shouldn't indicate a ton of time between doing one and doing the other. But when I was doing that, I was encouraged, and when I talked to the men that I'm helping, navigate this process, I encourage them to not edit that list. Don't be worried about the amends. As Peter talked about it, we look ahead and we go, well, I'm not putting this down because if I do, somebody's going to suggest I go see this person. And I say, look, dude, don't edit your list. Let it happen. You don't have to do anything. You're going to be in charge. I can't make anybody do it. We are volunteers in AA. And we share our experience, and somebody does it or doesn't. I'm sponsoring a guy and say, I'm frequently wrong. But if you think I'm wrong 80% of the time, why would you want me to be your sponsor? Why do we have to argue about anything? I got nothing. I'm just through arguing. My sponsor's a attorney, a criminal attorney, and he said he's been sober 42 years now. But Don says he hadn't argued for free in over 37 years. And I'm just through arguing. There's nothing to argue about, because I'll just make a suggestion, and so I say this is what it looks like to me, and I've kind of been sponsored that way, in a way that gave me the respect to make my decisions based on the information and based on the shared experience with me. But I'd mention, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of amends I have made, as Peter did. And when I did that first inventory, and I've mentioned here a couple of times that there were infidelities in my marriage during that first 7 years that we were married before getting sober. Now, Connie was unaware of those. And they weren't romances, just flings, overnight deal, whatever, but they certainly had been some. And absolutely included them in the inventory, absolutely included that on my 8-step list. Identified the harms as best I could, the betrayal of trust, a host of things. Then my sponsor and I sat down and looked at it and talked about that, and not just by my, not just make a living amend, which is the hiding place of so many alcoholics, the living amend. There's a long line over by that place, and but I said, after a lot of consultation and prayer and conversation, he and we landed on the spot that was going to do more harm than good. But we did the full 8-step process. We talked about what that amends would look like. We talked about what one would say and how I would navigate that territory if I were going to make it. I prayed for the willingness to make it without regard to the impact on me. I was willing to do it. But he said that, that I think that's going to do more harm than good. 4 years later, Connie and I are sitting at home. We're having a conversation, just a casual conversation. And out of the blue, she said, "Have you ever been unfaithful to me?" And I knew in that moment, perhaps intuitively knew, that a lie wasn't going to work. And not only that a lie wasn't going to work, I intuitively knew that the truth was called for. And the point I'm making is how grateful I am that I had already found the willingness. We had discussed what that would look like. We had done the 8-step work around that. And the 9th-step part, I had found that willingness, and we were able to have that conversation. And obviously it was painful and hurtful, and I commend her for the spiritual maturity to navigate through that and for us to get on the other side of it. And again, that was, 27 years ago, 28 years ago. But we did the work, and it was not trying to evade it. And Dr. Bob, he talks about with Bill when he was staying at Bill's house, right, in that early parts of his sobriety and those first few days and weeks that they're spending together. And of course, they're talking about this recovery thing. They're both excited, and Dr. Bob is saying, I know that this spiritual experience is necessary, but perhaps the cost is too high. And he was concerned about going out and the people in Akron knowing about him being an alcoholic, as many already did, obviously. But that's our perspective, and that he might ruin his reputation and lose his livelihood, and how that would negatively impact his family. And he said, at least the way it's written in the big book is, I'll do anything, he said, but that. And see, I will tell you in my recovery that I bumped up a number of times where I would say, I'll do anything but that. And I don't care what the but that is alluding to. The but that's are going to get me in trouble. The conditions upon which I will make an amends will get me in trouble. I need somebody else to help me understand the timing of it, and perhaps the nuance of the conversation, so it doesn't come like a blunt instrument on somebody, that I'm not getting my relief at someone else's expense, but also have to make sure that I'm not seemingly expressing concern for the other person when it is really my fear that is keeping me from moving forward. The impact on me is never to be the consideration. In the back of the book it talks about, I see an amen over here, right, on this stuff. And there's a wonderful passage in the back of the book in the story, Freedom from Bondage. And she describes rationalization as giving a socially acceptable explanation for socially unacceptable behavior. And she refers to that as insanity. And I can't tell you how often, whether it's about amends or it's something else in my life, that I identify what I want to do or what I don't want to do, and build a case back from that will be palatable to the people around me. And it might even be factually correct. But I need to understand, am I dodging? It says we are hard on ourselves and easy on others. So am I dodging anything because of fear? Peter talked about the impact that this is the beginning but a lifelong process. And I was talking with Jack and Cleo last night about another amend with my wife that was more recent and seemingly more innocuous than some of these big stories that we tell. And I've made amends to my wife. I've made amends for the same thing, for the same behavior, a couple of 3 different times sometimes, because over time I get more in touch with the impact, not the act, but the impact. Don P. used to say, we might think we know what we did to someone, but we don't know what it did to them. And you alluded to that. I don't know the ripple effect of that. And for years before getting sober, and sometimes after, you can tell, sometimes I can't tell a good joke from a bad joke. Sometimes I can't tell what's appropriate to say versus what's inappropriate. I grew up in a house where sarcasm was the order of the day. That's the way we played. And so I brought a lot of that into my relationship with Connie. The thing that attracted me most to Connie early on was how brave and independent and living out loud she was. And I was drawn to that. And the moment I got her into my sphere, I tried to tap all of that down. It's so strange that the very thing that might attract me to you, I will then try to buttonhole. So I would regularly, we would call it gaslighting today, but around my drinking, or around my behavior, because it wasn't don't drink, but it was the lies, the inconsistencies, the dishonesty, and she would, be right about something, and I would make her feel crazy. I would explain, I would get in a debate and undermine that, and bit by bit, death by 1,000 paper cuts, this vibrant woman began to lose her confidence. And I got sober, and I made amends for that. We had the conversation. And just about 4 years ago, I was doing a weekend like this, and I'm talking to you like I'm talking to you now, and I'm talking about this subject. And as I talked about it, I knew that wasn't done, and I got back home that Sunday afternoon. And I went back in and to talk with Connie. And I said, I know that I've said this before. I said, but what I want you to know, I said, I finally get it. I finally really understand what I did and how that made you feel. And I am so sorry. Our book says that mere mumbling of an apology is not an amends, but a sincere apology can be part of an amends. Because there's a real difference in I think, in me saying I'm sorry the way I said I'm sorry, let's move on. I'm sorry, get off my back. I said I was sorry. Versus, I am honestly sorry. I love you, I care about you, and I hurt you. And I'm really sorry. That's a big difference. And the look on her face changed because she knew. We'd had the intellectual conversation. Now this was a heart-to-heart, and she knew that I knew and that I meant it. And while that's not the big crash and burn stories, that's one of the most seminal moments for me in our 40 years together. I told you I totaled 6 automobiles and wrecked a bunch of cars, and my mom at 34 years old, my mom's still paying lawyer bills for me, still throwing pillows under my falls, still taking care of me. My dad had died when I was 18 and she was 47. My behavior kind of went off then, and I had made amends with her. But my daughter, at 19, got drunk, totaled her car, all the stuff that I'd done, and I dealt with that. Did the stuff we had to do that day or two. But then I called my mom and I said, Abby was in a wreck, and she said, well, I hope she's okay. I said, Mom, she's okay. I said, but the reason I'm calling is because I know we've had this conversation, but today I want you to know I know how you felt. I said, I've been afraid, and I've been angry, and I don't know what to do. I feel powerless. And I said, well, I knew what I did. I did not know how it felt. And that was a big moment between my mom and I. So I think these things can go on. I don't want to flog a dead horse, right? Because we want to, that's again, I think we know intuitively, hopefully, and most of these are things I've come back after I have been perhaps more awake and have a little more experience, and it lands on me at the right time. We don't run out and apologize, for this single thing a dozen times every time we run into somebody. So that's been an important thing. When I first got sober, I'm a compulsive gambler as well, and at 6 months sober, I went on a gambling binge and lost a lot of money. And I've had people say, "How much you lose?" I said, "Well, a lot of money is more than you have. Doesn't matter where you started. I lost more than we had." And so, but I went and I'm coming back and I'm talking to my little group about it, the folks I'd fallen in with, but I'm not telling Connie yet. I'm not that sober. And so I'd borrowed this money, right? First the casinos are calling to collect, but they had our work address, and I worked with my brother, so. And then I borrowed the money, and then it wasn't electronic banking, so I had to get a post office box that Connie didn't know about. And, I'm re-upping that loan every 90 days, trying to push that thing over, and just doing a bunch of stuff to manage this little secret over here. And I went to my sponsor, and I did tell Frank what I'd done, and we always kid. I thought he said I didn't have to tell Connie. But what he said was, he said, Steve, I can't make you tell her. I think that these principles would direct you to tell her. I said, let's look at it. It looks like this is something you need to own. He says, but if you don't deal with this now, you will deal with it later. I promise. So I moved to Richmond, Virginia, just over a year sober. I got another sponsor over there. Of course, I didn't fully fill him in on these details. And about a year and a half later, and I'm 2.5 years sober, I'm loving AA. But this pebble in my shoe is turning into a boulder. I'm not telling Connie. I'm starting to feel separate from the group. It comes between me and you and me and God. And I finally sat down but I hadn't gambled anymore. I sat down with Joe, my sponsor over there, and I told him the story. And all of a sudden I came into an amount of money that was going to let me pay off that loan without Connie knowing. And I said, this is perfect. I said, now, so I said, I'll pay it off. And I said, I don't want to hurt Connie. I'd signed the deal that the pledge, this wasn't the drinking pledge. I'd signed the pledge that she was going to leave me if I ever gambled again before that gambling slip happened. And I said, this would hurt her. It would destroy her confidence in our marriage. And I said, and I'm not going to do it again. I'm a changed man. I said, Joe, what do you think? And he said, I think you're a chicken shit. And he said, I believe you believe everything you said. I know you care about her. I know you don't want to hurt her. He said, but I think the real reason you're afraid to tell her is because you're unwilling to live with the consequences of the truth. He said, in AA, we don't quit making mistakes, but we start standing in front of the mistakes we make. And he said, I don't know whether she'll leave you or not, Steve. He said, I just think that number one, your sobriety may hang in the balance, and certainly your emotional sobriety is impacted every day. You've been carrying this for 2.5 years. So I went home and we had that conversation. And then I gambled twice after that. The second time I went, I just lost $100. I mean, I circled this casino. I had to be there for work. I just circled the crap table. And finally, I threw a $100 bill down. Whoever's rolling, rolled the craps. I ran to my room. I thought, oh, that was such a cheap lesson. Thanks, God. And flew home. And actually, even before I went home, I went to a meeting where Joe was, and I told him what I'd done. But I said, Joe, I'm so grateful. It was such a cheap lesson, and I see how that could just have easily have been a drink. And he said, well, you got to tell Connie. I said, Joe, it's $100. It's not even like real gambling. He said, well, why don't you go have a little near beer? And I'm going, Joe, I'm lesson learned. He said, no, go tell her. He said, she's probably going to be impressed that it didn't take you 2.5 years to tell her this time. And she wasn't that impressed, to be honest with you. But the point is, all of these things, I made amends. My brother was the most complicated relationship in my life. And I was 18 years sober before I realized that I was the complication. Now, we had a tough relationship. My dad died. My brother took over our family business when he was 22 years old. I started in that business when I was 20, and he was 24. He became the patriarch of our family. He was financially responsible for our family, and that's talking about a younger sister, and I got an older sister. He had grown men in their 40s working under him, sales guys, and then there I was, and having a job but not working, like I mentioned, and it's a longer story than I can tell today, but I was a salesman that couldn't make sales calls. So they start to notice after a couple years. And I put him in this untenable situation. But Johnny's a strong personality and a type A personality. And there were some real tough times, and there were some things he didn't, he could be tough, and he could be mean-spirited in things, and was sometimes. But I used all of that as something to hide behind. And I'd been able to sit down, and Johnny, kind of like Peter said, my brother's not a guy that wanted me to come sit down and said, John, I've joined AA, and they tell me that I need to make amends for, he would have just blown that off. But what I did was look for opportunities to have conversations that acknowledged some of the things that I had done, and open that conversation up and see where it'd go. When I left, it says in the 8th step that we want to use this newfound information about ourselves to form the best possible relations with all people. Doesn't mean they'll all be great. That might be a birthday card, right? It might be a birthday card and a Christmas card. Or it might be a full reconciliation of a relationship. When I left in 2013, working with my brother and the company we'd sold some stuff. It was time for me to go, but I left. About 2 months later, and we talked occasionally, but about 2 months later, I butt dialed him. Right, and I looked, I saw the phone ring, and it was him, and I hung it up, and I sent a little text that said, I'm sorry. It's an inadvertent call, I'm sorry. And he texted back, he said, don't be sorry. He said, I love you, and I miss you. And at the time, I was 58 years old, and my brother was 62 years old. And I don't think either of us had ever said to the other that I love you. And I'm the guy in recovery, right? I'm the guy, I'm the one going around the country talking, and I can't tell my brother I love him. But he found a way to bridge that gap with me. And we'd never hugged. Not even that newcomer hug where you don't touch. And now we hug each other when we see each other. And now there's a softness that wasn't always there. And I really credit him more than me. So like I said, but what I'd done to him one day, he came in, this was before all of this happened, and he walked into my office, and we were going at it about something. And I said, you make everybody feel like they're a burden to you. And he left the office and went back to his office. And about 30 minutes later, he came back in, and he looked at me and he said, do I still? And that was important. By do I still, he knew that he had done that. But he said, am I still doing that? And the answer was no. The answer was he hadn't done that for a long time, but I still had him in jail, right? I still was holding him prisoner for transgressions of years ago because I could not change. I could not let him out of the box. And that allowed us to have that conversation. These amends, what we're trying to do is get right with our fellow man. What we're trying to do is have the best possible relationship, because once I'm in the midst of that, once I have begun that process, then I'm free to help you guys, which, by the way, is how I get my help. Right before the promises, after it talks about doing these amends, it tells me how to go about it in a way that I didn't see for a long time. You know how we have all sat in a lot of meetings. I'm going to guess you have heard this, and I'm going to guess you may have even said it a time or two. I certainly have. And that's the part where it says that, we're not doormats. As God's people, we crawl before no one. And that's in there. But the sentence that precedes that says we are kind, considerate, tactful, and humble without being servile or scraping. See, so I want to take an attitude of kindness, of courtesy, respect, compassion to that process of those amends. I don't have to do it hanging my head. I don't have to do it shuffling my feet. I don't have to be servile or scraping, and I don't have to crawl. But I want to be kind, considerate, tactful, and humble as I go about that process. And I forget that sometimes. And then we get to those promises that we, again, like how it works, we read so much that sometimes we don't hear it. And they're just the flip side of those bedevilments that Peter introduced us to last night. That is, now I arrive and I have been spiritually awakened. I'm getting ready to go into the 10th step, and it will say that I have entered the world of the Spirit. I'm just in the foyer. I'm barely in. And the rest of the steps are going to take me all the way in the house and help me form this deeper relationship. This is fear of people and of economic insecurity will leave us. And those are in the same sentence. I think to some degree that's there because when I am willing, that the freedom comes in the 8th step for me. Now there's no space between that. I was talking to Gary Brown, and this was at the same time that I realized I hadn't done that fear inventory. And I went to Gary and I owed a financial amends from a gambling debt that I'd had for 20 years. And again, it felt like a lot of money. And I was going to pay him when I got some extra money, but I never get any extra money, apparently. And I said, Gary, people in AA tell me that when I'm ready to make that amends, that God will put this person in my path. I said, how do you think I'll know when I'm willing to make it? He said, Steve, it's just easy. He said, you'll be in your car on the way over to his house with the damn money. He said, anything else is just a story you're telling yourself to feel better right now. And that there's no space between willingness and action. That action is the demonstration of willingness. So when I am willing, when I'm honestly, truly willing in the truest sense of the word, then I'm free. Because if I bump into you, I'm ready. I'm ready. Whatever it takes, whatever it's supposed to look like. And that frees me up for me to be of some use to you. Again, your endurance is unbelievable. Thank you guys for hanging out with us this afternoon.
That was a load. Thank you, guys. Listen, this was Peter's last session. He's going to be leaving in the morning. And I got to tell you, Steve blew it because now he's got to go tell Connie that he bet for $20 on that we could get Peter's jacket off this weekend. I'll turn the air conditioning on now.